You've heard about the opioid scare, often referred to as the opioid epidemic. You've probably known someone who, at some point, had to take opioids after a surgery, or take them permanently for chronic pain. You may even know someone who had to struggle with opioid addiction. Maybe you've struggled with it yourself. You've probably heard about all of the people dying from overdoses of opioids. You've probably heard that this is due to greedy pharmaceutical companies and unscrupulous doctors running pill mills and getting patients addicted. What you've been told is a lie. I'm Shane Killian, and for the last decade I've been covering this issue on my podcast and my YouTube channel. The videos I've amassed over the years cover the gamut of this issue, but people have found this playlist of old videos to be difficult to go through, as we were just covering the issue as it happened and as information came along. Well, now, this 6-part series is going to cover all of the information in those old videos and more. But first, we need to talk about the real issue causing all of the problems: the war on drugs. In the 1920s, the country was almost torn apart by prohibition. Moralistic busybodies and power-hungry politicians tried to stop people from drinking at home and gathering in saloons. In reality, everything was pushed underground, with the production and sale of liquor moved to the black market and saloons moved to speakeasies. And with it came crime. The notorious gangs led by people such as Al Capone tore apart cities like New York and Chicago. In remote areas, revenuers searched for moonshine stills, which often resulted in armed conflict. And it even caused a border crisis due to the smuggling of tequila from Mexico and rum from Jamaica.
When the 18th Amendment was passed, I earnestly hoped, with a host of advocates of temperance, that it would be generally supported by public opinion. That this has not been the result, but rather that drinking generally has increased, that the speakeasy has replaced the saloon, not only unit for unit, but probably twofold, if not threefold, that a vast army of lawbreakers has been recruited and financed on a colossal scale, that many of our best citizens piqued at what they regarded as an infringement of their private rights have openly and unabashed disregarded the 18th Amendment, that as an inevitable result, respect for all law has been greatly lessened, that crime has increased to an unprecedented degree.
Once the failure of prohibition became obvious, there was only one thing to do.
Of course I am delighted, but not surprised by the final repeal of the 18th Amendment. I felt all along that when this matter was properly submitted to the rank and file of our people, they would readily see that it had no place in our Constitution. It would be very difficult, if not impossible, to estimate the benefit that will come to this country from the lesson taught to the coming generations, to make it their business to see that no such matter as this is ever again made the subject of federal constitutional law.
But we didn't learn the lesson. Marijuana and other drugs stayed illegal, and in 1971, Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
But in reality, his motivations were anything but sincere. Here's what John Ehrlichman told Dan Baum of Harper's Magazine over 20 years later.
You want to know what this was really all about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. we could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did.
And the result was heroin and other dangerous drugs on the street causing overdoses. Like Prohibition before it, the drug war makes drugs deadlier by putting their manufacture, distribution, and sale into the hands of a criminal black market, which doesn't care about the welfare of their customers and doesn't worry about things like dosage control. People don't overdose and die in some crazy attempt to chase a bigger high. They overdose because when they buy those black market drugs, they have no idea how much of what they're getting is the drug and how much is the cutting agent, or even what it's cut with. But don't think any of this had any effect on the addiction rate. Throughout the century, the rate of addiction was, and stays to this day, around 1.3% of the population.
We didn't have an illegal drug in this country until 1914, when we passed the Harrison Anti-Drug Act. Just before 1914, the government said, we have 1.3% of the people in this country addicted to drugs. God, we can't have that, right? So they passed this law. Now you fast forward 56 years to 1970, the beginning of the war on drugs. In 1970, the government said 1.3% of the population is addicted to drugs. Can't have it. Got to start a war on drugs. 36 years later and $1 trillion and all these lives lost, 1.3% of the population is addicted to drugs.
We'll go over the reasons why and how addiction, as much as many people don't want to hear this, is not a disease. It's a symptom of an underlying issue. If anything, prescription opioids fare far better than illegal drugs. Several different studies in respected journals like the New England Journal of Medicine have found that less than 1% of those who are prescribed opioids ever become addicted. The risk of overdose is less than 0.2%. And yet, government has been blaming the prescription drug market for all of this when, as this series will establish, they know it to be a lie. Here's a segment from my podcast in 2019 when the DEA arrested pharmaceutical executives over the opioid crisis. Rochester Drug Cooperative supplies wholesale pharmaceuticals to retail pharmacies in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. They've just been charged with a $20 million fine, and 2 of their former executives have been arrested on charges of drug trafficking. The 2 men ran their drug empire from a secret bunker where hitmen were used to threaten other drug suppliers and establish their gang turf in... No, I'm kidding. They didn't do anything remotely like that. Although you might think so to hear U.S. Attorney Jeffrey S. Berman talk about it, he vowed that his office would, quote, do everything in its power to combat this epidemic, from street-level dealers to the executives who illegally distribute drugs from their boardrooms. Of the 2 men, he said, why did they do it? Greed. Gotta love how they can throw the word greed in when what they're really talking about is just making money. Yes, they made a profit for their company. That's what they're supposed to do. In addition to conspiracy to distribute drugs and conspiracy to defraud the United States, the 2 men are charged with failing to file suspicious order reports. So apparently if a pharmacy orders some oxycodone from them, they're supposed to analyze that order to see if it's suspicious and then report it. In other words, they have to be unpaid law enforcement investigators for the federal government just to stay in business. Fourth Amendment be damned. They claim that RDC sold fentanyl to pharmacies that they knew were turning around and selling on the black market. So you might think that, yeah, these guys were being a little unsavory, but it's completely ridiculous that these things are even illegal to begin with. The reason for so much addiction and overdose is the stupid, insane war on drugs, not the drugs themselves. This comes just 5 days after 60 doctors, pharmacists, and other licensed professionals were charged with prescribing more than 32 million pain pills. Gotta love how they count the total pills, not the number of prescriptions or doses or something like that. Gotta keep that number scary high. There have also been 1,600 cases against Purdue Pharma and other manufacturers of opioids, which will be tried in the Northern District of Ohio. So here's one lie from CNBC. Overdoses on prescription opioids have taken more than 20,000 lives in the last 2 decades, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. That is absolutely and completely wrong. This figure covers not only prescription opioids, but also opioids obtained on the black market. Most of them didn't even have a prescription. The fact is, if you're prescribed opioids from a doctor, you have less than a 1% chance of becoming addicted and an overdose risk of less than 0.2%. But you'll never hear that from politicians or the mainstream media. Something else you'll never hear is that an overwhelming majority of these overdoses are from people abusing other drugs such as alcohol. So it's not just illicit black market opioids, but the fact that people are drinking alcohol with them as well. And that combination can be deadly. Also, most people who overdose have a history of mental illness. The war on drugs does these people no good. All it does is make them reluctant to seek help, since it would mean admitting to a federal crime, one the feds are very serious about enforcing. The numbers for opioid overdose have been soaring upward, even as the number of prescriptions has been plummeting, as we've covered before. The DEA and the U.S. Attorney's Office want to point the finger at other people to cover up for the fact that their moronic war on drugs fails and fails again, and in fact makes things worse as they continue to torture pain patients and interfere with the decisions of licensed medical professionals, and a complicit news media happily passes along their bogus propaganda. There's a recurring theme in there that we'll see. They'll talk about prescription opioids, but as soon as they talk about overdoses, they sneakily drop the word prescription. They have to put their thumb on the scale by including deaths from black market opioids while leaving you with the impression that it's prescription opioids that do it. And as we'll cover, the CDC is complicit in this lie as well as the DEA. In fact, the big problem now is a direct result of all this opioid hysteria. It's called INF, illicitly manufactured fentanyl. Not that made by pharmaceutical companies and prescribed by doctors, made by black marketeers and sold by criminal gangs. A 2016 analysis found that over 85% of the opioid-related fatalities in Massachusetts were from the illicit forms of heroin and fentanyl, not the prescription medicine. And data from New York City shows that most of the deaths from overdose are attributable to drug combinations, mostly abusing both opioids and alcohol together. That's called multi-pharmacology, and as we'll cover, our government knows this is the cause of most overdose deaths, but insists on blaming only one drug, and that's generally the opioids, and counting it as pharmaceutical opioids when it's really the illicit ones. Even the CDC statistics show this, as the executioner and I covered on the podcast back in 2018. We've covered the horrific effects of the government's war on opioids and how their attempt to stop overdoses has resulted in overdoses increasing exponentially. The CDC just released statistics covering the year 2017 that give us more information on that. Total number of opioid-related deaths rose 8.5% last year, yet deaths from prescription opioids actually fell 2%. And remember how I keep telling everyone to watch out for that word prescription, because if they just say opioids, then it includes illegal opioids like heroin.
Yeah, it's very misleading when they talk about, opioids. Well, what type of opioids? Prescription or just illegal?
Except, get this, heroin-related deaths fell 4%.
4%.
So what's going on here? What's causing that big rise? Well, the category is synthetic opioids other than methadone. Mostly what we're talking about is fentanyl and its analogs. So this puts a lot of the previous statistics into context. From 2010 to 2016, heroin deaths increased 8 times as fast as the number of heroin users. Well, it seems from this new data that the problem isn't heroin, it's heroin laced with fentanyl, or even fentanyl masquerading as heroin. Fentanyl is several times more potent than heroin, and some analogs like carfentanil are thousands of times more potent, so it's easy for users to overdose on it when they think all they're getting is heroin and they just don't understand how strong it is.
Yeah, and that's a problem with the drug war. It creates a huge monopoly for black markets to take over, and there really isn't any self-regulation going on, so then...
Yeah, they don't put labels on it or anything.
Yeah, they don't put labels, obviously.
Meanwhile, far more people continue to be killed by cigarettes and alcohol. For that matter, more people are killed by diabetes and the flu.
Yeah, usually government tends to take something that's very small in deaths, and they exaggerate it to a point where they think, oh, it's a huge epidemic, but if you look at all the other things that are killing people, they're a lot more than the thing that's of concern right now, quote unquote.
Well, we've also talked about how people overestimate low risks and underestimate high risks, and you talk about, oh, there's this dangerous new chemical that kills, 10 people a year out of 330 million. That's just a blip, and yet they can make this huge scare over it.
Yeah.
Well, according to New York Times health reporter Margot Sanger-Katz, quote, "Unlike heroin, which is derived from poppy plants, fentanyl can be manufactured in a laboratory, and it is often easier to transport because it is more concentrated. Unexpected combinations of those drugs can overwhelm even experienced drug users. While the opioid epidemic was originally concentrated in rural white populations, the death toll is becoming more widespread. The penetration of fentanyl into more heroin markets may explain recent increases in overdose deaths among older urban black Americans. Those who used heroin before the recent changes to the drug supply might be unprepared for the strength of the new mixtures."
That explains it, because when you have a market, like with any market, once you restrict the supply of one commodity, they're just going to use another commodity to substitute it.
Well, yeah, and we've talked about this before. As government puts more and more restrictions on prescription opioids, not only addicts, but also desperate pain sufferers often turn to the black market for relief. But according to Sanger-Katz, quote, "Many of the measures which have passed the House but not reached the Senate floor are focused on reducing medical prescription of opioids. So they're just going to make the problem worse."
What is it? Insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results?
Yeah, I think that's also government actions.
Yeah, that's government in general. They just say, oh, it didn't work yesterday. Well, we'll just do it again and see how it works. Kind of reminds me of kind of the movie Dory, where it's kind of like the short-term memory where they can't remember, oh, we passed legislation, I don't know, a month ago, but let's do it again and see what happens,
Cracking down on patients and doctors is horrible. And as we'll cover, it's actually driving many pain patients to commit suicide, since the removal of their best medical option means a lifetime of constant, unceasing, unbearable pain. All of those deaths, the suicides and the overdoses, are on the heads of the drug warriors. The reason for these overdoses is the war on drugs. Pain patients, wrongly denied the medicine they need, turn to the black market in desperation. And others seek out heroin for other purposes, but drug dealers are substituting various forms of fentanyl, which is cheaper to make, but dozens of times as potent as heroin. One variant, carfentanil, is thousands of times as potent. So they take what would be a safe dosage for heroin and end up overdosing, simply because they have no way of knowing what they're getting. The whole narrative of someone having surgery, taking opioids for the pain, becoming addicted, and overdosing is pure fiction. And it's fiction that kills and sentences many patients to a lifetime of unnecessary suffering. And hopefully, by the end of this series, you'll have all the information you need to stop falling for it. Stay tuned.